It's Game Boy World, and this is Cosmo Tank! Game Boy World has frequently brought heartbreak across the past 60-odd games we've looked at. Some games have been heartbreakingly dull, some heartbreakingly bad, and one or two just heartbreakingly overpriced in the aftermarket relative to their quality. Cosmo Tank brings a different kind of heartbreak altogether. This is not the tragedy of a poor or apathetic game, or the sorrow of a mundane Sokoban clone. Rather, Cosmo Tank arrives rife with the disappointment of enormous, unfulfilled potential. By far the most varied and ambitious title we've yet seen on Game Boy, Cosmo Tank features three styles of play in a nonlinear, exploratory, multimodal shooter. This is the sort of game you'd expected to have seen on the NES during its maturing years, not this early on the humble Game Boy, and yet, here we are. Cosmo Tank will likely remind you of NES games like WURM, Journey to the Center of the Earth, or Golgo 13, Top Secret Episode, combining standard console action game mechanics with first-person mazes in combat. Given the technical limitations and storage constraints that define the Game Boy, the mere existence of such an intricate creation deserves respect and praise. But much like those other games, Cosmo Tank doesn't quite manage to pull its disparate parts together into a perfect whole. Each unique section of the game stumbles over unique flaws, all of which add up to diminish this nearly phenomenal game to a good, not great, attempt at pushing the limitations of the platform. Cosmo Tank places players in the command console of the eponymous war machine, which more than lives up to its name. It's a tank, but it can also travel between planets, making it truly cosmic. The game takes place across 5 separate worlds, and the middle section allows you to pick and choose the order in which you tackle them. Mostly. The story begins, mandatorily, on the creative named desert planet Deza, where you learn the basic routine for advancement. Each planet features top-down action sequences as you explore and hunt for enemy bases. You can dock with power-up stations here, communicate with your home base for clues, and acquire new permanent abilities for your tank. In the course of your exploration on the surface, you'll come across caves you can drive your tank into. Once inside, these generally change the point of view to a first-person perspective. As you'd expect from an 8-bit game, the first-person portions play out with a step-by-step progression rather than moving smoothly. The mazes allow you to move strictly in cardinal directions, branching occasionally at intersections. The mazes play host to the game's bosses, as well as sub-bosses that regulate that world's power. You'll also find so-called item zones where you can recharge your tank's shields and secondary weapon, and occasionally perform other feats as well. Once you've completed a world or find yourself impeded by a barrier that has to be circumvented with upgrades from a different planet, you can roll onto a launching platform and select a different planet to travel to. At this point, the tank transforms into a space fighter and zaps its way through a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up, which might remind you of Compile's The Guardian Legend. Alas, the vertical shooter sequences in Cosmo Tank lack the substance and style of Compile's NES classic, and the deficiencies of this mode embody the failings of the game as a whole. Cosmo Tank has a lot going for it, but it perhaps unavoidably suffers from the jack-of-all-trades master-of-none sensation that characterized most multimodal 8-bit games. Cosmo Tank's shoot-'em-up sections feel brief and simplistic. Your tank ship has a standard weapon and a screen-clearing smart bomb, and that's about it. Enemies attack in basic patterns, and occasionally asteroids fall into view and yield smart bomb recharges when shattered. But there's very little challenge to these portions, which is probably just as well considering your limited capabilities. The biggest annoyance with Cosmo Tank's main weapon is that in the top-down views, both planetary and interstellar, your main gun doesn't even reach the full length of the screen. When you don't even have the range to span the Game Boy's sad little excuse for a screen, you know you've got problems. At least the vertical shooting portions maintain a brisk pace. That's more than can be said for the land-based sequences. Roaming around on the planet's surfaces, you have to deal with the same limited range for your main gun, but you also have to contend with the fact that enemies appear in endless waves from all directions. That's not inherently a bad thing, but it quickly grows tiresome here. Your tank only fires in the direction in which it's facing, which means that as you're trying to cruise along from one destination to the next, you constantly have to pause and steer around in different directions while you try and blast enemies that appear as soon as the previous wave is taken out. This creates an annoying stop-start-stop rhythm to the exploration that does the games no favor. Again, it doesn't help that you can only fire about a third of the length of the screen. Many of the infinitely spawning enemies move and fire much more quickly than your tank moves, too. Thankfully, only one type of enemy appears at a time on a planetary surface, and they'll eventually change out to a new formation after you've shot down enough of them, or switch to a different mode by driving into a communications platform or entering a cave. Still, the hazards you face as you explore are more annoying than interesting. The first-person sequences mostly make up for the other modes' failings. While simplistic, the cavern corridors offer a welcome respite from the incessant harassment of the overworld and help create the sensation of a much larger world than actually exists within the cramped maps of the game. The maze sequences tend to link different portions of the planetary surfaces, often providing helpful shortcuts from place to place. Sure, you still have to battle enemies in these maze portions, but they're far easier to deal with than the non-stop barrage of monsters above ground. When you encounter an enemy in first-person mode, which happens more or less at random, your progress halts and you become locked in place as you shoot it out with a bad guy. Essentially, you spin in place and fire at your opponent, which revolves around you and fires back. The first-person combat in Cosmo Tank operates under slightly strange rules. Enemies constantly fire at you, but you only take damage if you're hit by a projectile head-on. There's about a 60-degree vulnerable spot in the center of the screen where enemy fire will cause you damage. Otherwise, it does nothing. It doesn't really make sense, but you can't really be expected to maneuver in 3D space with a D-pad and 2 face buttons, so it's a fair compromise. Generally, you'll face a single enemy at a time, though some foes can split into 2. Combat mode provides you with a small radar in the left corner that allows you to track your foe's position relative to your targeting reticle, which can be handy for drawing a bead on them. It also allows you to track the direction of their movements, which is important for predicting attacks and positioning yourself to prevent taking a surprise hit. I mentioned Golgo 13 for NES before, and the shootout mode here works almost exactly the same way as in that game, minus that game's cheap hits from off-screen. You can spin your tank through 360 degrees of free motion, unlike the constrained cardinal movement you employ outside of combat, while shifting the reticle up and down to draw a bead on enemies at different elevations. It's a simple shooting gallery, but it works. The encounter rate is low enough not to be annoying, and once you get the feel of combat, it's pretty easy to avoid taking damage in these shootouts. In a small, thoughtful touch, once you complete a combat encounter, your tank automatically reorients itself in the direction you were facing when you were ambushed, which goes a long way toward minimizing disorientation. The real purpose of the maze sequences, however, is to hunt down each planet's life core guardians. This is where the game goes awry. Cosmo Tank's bosses are, to be quite frank, terrible. At best, they're drawn-out endurance efforts that pose little challenge but take forever to whittle down. At worst, they're wildly challenging and borderline unfair, plus take forever to whittle down. In any case, they take entirely too long to destroy with your basic weapons. Even a full stock of smart bombs and liberal use of the charge shot upgrade don't do much to ease the tedium. Cosmo Tank is really a fairly short game, but it uses the old 8-bit crutch of insanely difficult and poorly tuned bosses to arrest your progress. You'll also find a few bosses outside the maze, which play out in the top-down tank exploration format. These are even worse than the first-person bosses because they fill a huge chunk of the screen, fire quick projectiles, and grossly outmatch your sluggish, weak tank. The frustrating thing about Cosmo Tank is that there's almost a solution to these problems here, built right into the game. The RPG-like maze mode is matched by an RPG-like experience system, but its implementation falls disappointingly flat. As you destroy enemies, you gain experience for your tank. At certain experience thresholds, your tank levels up, gaining additional health. This is all well and good, but if you die a few times and have to continue, you lose all your experience and start over from zero. Continuing allows you to pick up where you left off with all your progress intact, but your tank reverts to its default health level. Similarly, you'll occasionally earn a random weapon power-up from enemies, which doubles the width and power of your main gun. But you only keep this boost until you die, at which point you revert to your standard gun. This is the same sort of setback you experience in the Gradius games, frustration shooter fans should know well. But as limiting as being dialed back to default power in a fast-paced shoot-'em-up can be, having all that progress erased in a slow-moving multi-format adventure game feels much worse. There's nothing more awful in Cosmo Tank than losing to a boss while fully powered up, then being sent to the entrance of its lair with half the health and firepower you had during your previous attempt. If you couldn't take out the bad guy at full strength, how are you supposed to win without those advantages? At this point, you really have no choice but to venture back out and farm enemies for experience for 10 or 15 minutes before taking another shot at the boss. Cosmo Tank draws heavily on RPGs, but it manages to combine the worst part of RPG grinding with the repetitive try again mentality of a shooter. And honestly, it's almost a disaster. Now don't get me wrong, I don't hate Cosmo Tank. There's a lot of really cool, ambitious stuff happening here, especially for a 25-year-old Game Boy game. But it's needlessly punishing and grindy in a few key points, and it really diminishes the overall experience. The game would really work brilliantly with just a few small tweaks. For instance, if leveling up were a permanent benefit, Cosmo Tank would be great. Heck, even if it had a password-based continue system so you could call it a day when you got tired of grinding for health and not have to start from the beginning the next time around, that would be great too. Unfortunately, the game can't quite decide what it is. On one hand, it wants to be a grand, non-linear, exploratory action shooter with a heavy RPG influence. On the other, it wants to be a snappy, score-driven combat game. It combines both the best and worst of these genres into a promising but unpolished jumble that draws you in with great ideas. Then it punishes you for being a flawed, imperfect human being. There was nothing else like this on Game Boy back in 1990, and I can definitely see where it would have been incredibly engrossing at the time, and why so many people have fond memories of it. But its unfriendly design choices mean that it doesn't hold up as well as you might hope in retrospect. We've seen enough games that combine RPG and action elements without taking such a punitive angle on things that Cosmo Tank's occasional forays into hatefulness undermine its appeal. There's a germ of a brilliant idea in Cosmo Tank, and I feel like its issues could have been ironed out with a sequel. Sadly, we never saw one. Cosmo Tank is credited to Atlus, this being their second Game Boy release after Quirk, and a company called Asuka Technologies. This is the only game ever credited to Asuka Technologies, which is perhaps why we never saw a sequel. They weren't around to create the game. Most online sources credit Asuka as the developer and Atlus as the publisher, but that may not have been the case precisely. According to a Digital Press forum post by NES historian and curator Chris Covell, Asuka Technologies was meant to be an American imprint for Atlus, a publisher, not a developer. Whatever the actual relationship between Atlus and Asuka, it appears to be a close one. And really, it shouldn't be surprising that a punishingly difficult first-person RPG-like game would come from the company that was finding its groove with the Megami Tensei series right around this time. The 8-bit Megaten RPGs were pretty ruthless and unfriendly too, but that franchise had time to evolve and undergo refinement. Cosmo Tank, alas, is a promising but ultimately vestigial bit of Atlus history. With a few iterations, it too could have become a beloved series. But instead, it's a rough, yet intriguing Game Boy gem that deserves its fans' affection, even if it's not likely to earn many new fans. For more noble failures, keep watching Game Boy World.